Hello, my name is Tom Moran, and I'm with CenturyLink, and I'm here with my colleague Achim Kronbach, also from CenturyLink, and we're going to do a little webinar today on managed cloud services and the comparison of those services with the traditional IT services model. So I'll start with a little introduction of myself, and then I'll ask Achim to introduce himself. So I have about 20 years of history with the company, most of that in managed services and IT services. And CenturyLink as a company really has three main pillars of our portfolio, which is our traditional network business, probably what we're most well known for, a security portfolio of managed security services that is also known worldwide, and then finally our IT services business, which is where Achim and I work and what we're going to talk about today. So Achim, maybe you can do a quick intro of yourself.
Yes, my name is Achim Kronbach. I'm a solution architect for IT and cloud services, worked since 2 years for CenturyLink. And before this, I worked mainly in the IT outsourcing industry as a solution lead.
All right, that's great. Thanks, Achim. So the agenda for today is going to be just a little bit of history of CenturyLink's position in the cloud market, and then kind of a segue from there. And then we're going to talk about some of the challenges of providing those kinds of services in a cloud universe with an internal staff in that traditional model that a lot of IT organizations have worked with. And then finally, we're going to talk about what we've seen as an evolution of these platforms into kind of a best of both worlds scenario at CenturyLink, where we have what we think is a great solution for managed cloud services that combines some of the traditional advantages of IT service models that came out of managed service organizations or internal teams with the agility, flexibility, and scalability of the cloud world. And then finally, at the end, we'll do just a quick summary and some key takeaways. So what's CenturyLink's history with the cloud? The company, again, for about 20 years has been operating in the cloud and IT managed services space. CenturyLink has gone through a number of iterations and acquisitions. Probably the most significant in this space was the acquisition of the Savvis business back in 2011. Since that time, we've also acquired a number of other technology companies, and those companies have really allowed us to expand our portfolio into a unique position in the industry, right? And today we are one of very few providers worldwide that have a managed service certification for both AWS, Azure, and VMware. So that VMware certification sort of is what ties us to some of the traditional IT world. And obviously AWS and Azure represent sort of the leaders in the public hyperscale cloud world. We're also a leading company in terms of the provision and management of a multi-cloud platform for IT managed services. So we were one of the first companies to build a tool set that's designed for multi-cloud management and then expand the functions and capabilities of that tool set to include not only the public cloud universe, but also the traditional IT world. So bringing together kind of the best of both worlds into what is usually referred to as hybrid IT. And then finally, we have access to and points of presence in about 2,200 data centers around the world, which represents a significantly greater number of connection points on our network than most of our competitors in the space. So from there, now that you have a little bit of background about CenturyLink, I'm going to ask Achim to talk a little bit about kind of that managed services background, right? And just briefly talk about kind of what his history is, as well as what the history of the managed service space is.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I think, first of all, when one talks about managed services, it's important to define what are these managed services. And if we are talking about managed services, we mean that a service provider like CenturyLink takes over the day-to-day activities for managing workloads like operating systems, like databases, like web servers, application servers, and so on. And this means somebody does monitoring, in case something happens, does incident management, or just these activities like applying patches, and doing the day-to-day configuration work on these machines that they run reliably, securely, and stable. And looking there from what was the traditional model of this, it was typically that an enterprise said, we don't want to do it, it's not our business. It's not strategic. It's our business to produce wonderful machines. We do it too expensively. Let's ask somebody, a service provider from the market who has a scale and scope to do it much cheaper. And the third motivation to ask a managed service provider was typically, we don't do it well. We can't keep our internal SLAs, or even we don't know our internal SLAs, we don't have them. So let's ask the experts to do it and keep them accountable.
Right. So in that traditional model, I think most people who've experienced that would say that there were certainly some challenges in that model. And some of those are well known by people who've experienced that. Some companies are still struggling with some of those major challenges. I'm wondering, because you have so much experience in this area, Akeem, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you think some of those really big challenges were with that legacy or traditional model.
Yes, I think to understand the legacy challenges of this model, one has to see what was the main driver for the service provider. Typically, the service provider, independently of what was the driver for the enterprise, what arrived at the service provider was that he has to reduce the costs. A CIO of an enterprise typically expected a cost reduction of around 20% at least, which meant that the service provider, as he had additional costs, he had to do the migration, he had a cost of sales, he had as well, he had to provide a profit to his shareholders or to the owners of the business. So typically he had to reduce costs compared to the enterprise by 40% or even more. And to produce these services, and I'm using the word produce intentionally, at these times, 15 years ago, people were talking about producing IT services like in a factory efficiently. These cost reductions he achieved mainly by 3 measures. And this was typically standardization across all customers. If possible, do it the same way, that he can use one set of architecture, one set of tools, one set of processes across all customers. The second means was typically virtualization. And this virtualization was just a technology evolution that occurred in parallel to this, but reduced drastically costs if you shared the hardware across different workloads. And the third main cost reduction measure was to replace expensive on-site resources with employees located in cheaper countries, especially in Eastern Europe and in India. And
so go ahead, sorry.
And these were in the end the 3 measures that all service providers, some more, some less, applied to achieve the expected cost savings.
Right, so in the end, the model was do it fast, do it cheap, and in most cases do it offshore. Right, and of course, as a result, there's a number of challenges there. Right, if you're continually fighting to drive cost out of a business and you're focused exclusively on efficiency, then obviously there's some things you're going to lose. So maybe talk a little bit about what some of the shortcomings were from the customer's perspective in that scenario, where the entire focus of the managed service provider was basically to standardize and to take cost out, and that the impact that had on the organization that was being served.
Yes, I think it was a good formulation that they used. The focus was on efficiency. The service provider tried rather to increase, let's say, increase the bang for the buck instead of reducing the buck for the bang. So the result was, for example, a lack of innovation. Customers, they had long-term contracts of 5 to 7 years, and it could be that after the 7 years, they still had the same technology platform that they used 10 years ago. And it was as well, as I said, it was a long-term contract. It was a vendor lock-in. They put all their systems to achieve maximum economies of scale with one service provider and committed to use the service provider for many years. It was all standardized. The processes, ITIL processes, were strictly enforced, and they were typically rather inflexible and everything but agile. If the customer needed something special, it was possible, no problem, but it cost extra. And typically it was a significant additional charge. And as well, one shortcoming, as of most outsourcings, sooner or later, often the shift from on-site resources to offshore resources was combined with a loss of with redundancies, loss of knowledge that was kept on site, and in the end, the customer lost all his knowledge about the technology. He just kept a retained organization, but this retained organization was typically rather working on things like contract management, service management, and these things. But this was no secret, but it was okay for the enterprise, because at this time, the purpose of IT was just provide cheap and reliable IT services. It was a cost center that was non-strategic, and then it was just okay to have these shortcomings.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And pretty significant information in the IT. The role of IT shifted, right? And you really were looking to your technology organization and your CIO to help drive innovation and not just drive costs out of the business. And so when companies struggled with that type of scenario, then all of a sudden they looked at, okay, well, maybe we were providing some of these things internally, maybe we lost some of those skill sets or capabilities, but now all of a sudden we're being expected to operate in this new world where we have a much greater complexity than we had before, right? We traditionally, even if we were relying on a managed service provider, at least we knew that most of our infrastructure was inside four walls of a data center, and we probably knew where physically that data center was. Now we might have some applications that are sitting on a platform as a service. We might have some that are sitting with a SaaS provider. We might have some that are sitting in our own data center. And increasingly, new applications are coming along that might be native to the cloud and really have never been within our control from an infrastructure standpoint, which creates another set of complexity and challenges, right? And that leads to some fundamental skill set challenges, right? So a lot of legacy organizations had their expertise either leave en masse when they outsource things, or they kept the same expertise that they had when they were running things in a traditional way. And bringing new people into the organization who are born in the cloud, cloud native, IT services type people creates a little bit of disruption, and it creates challenges. And in many cases, certainly here in the Netherlands, I know in other parts of EMEA, we have significant skill shortages where there's, job openings for people in development roles and things like that, there are sometimes, 20 or 30 job openings for just a single candidate that's on the market. So there's going to be an ongoing challenge to fill some of those major roles that are driving the evolution of IT, right? And finally, companies that are using the cloud, a lot of them have moved to the cloud initially for agility, for flexibility, for scalability, and cost control wasn't necessarily a priority, although some companies were led to believe that they would also achieve significant cost savings. And in many cases, those cost savings haven't materialized, and as a result, the IT organization has costs that are spiraling out of control, or a bill that's very unpredictable in terms of from one month to the next, they might see significant increases in those costs and not really understand what's driving that and how to predict those costs on an ongoing basis, right? And then finally, you have an organization that used to be sort of organized in pretty specific roles around these people did development, other people did operations, and now increasingly those two functions have been brought together. But in many cases, it's the development that is the part that really drives the IT organization from what it wants to be and philosophically, and the operations is more of an afterthought or seen as the less attractive portion of that role. And so companies ideally can standardize and outsource some of those operational tasks and focus as much of their energy as possible on the development, the innovation, the things that are ultimately going to drive their business.
Yes, absolutely. So, as you said, everybody wants to do the dev, but nobody wants to do the ops.
Yeah, exactly right. So maybe you could talk, Akeem, now about, a little bit about how over the course of the last 3 to 5 years, as we've brought together different technologies and different processes and people, sort of what the philosophy has been for CenturyLink to build our sort of best of both worlds architecture for this kind of challenge.
I think the main part of this architecture is that it's based on software and automation. Previously, when you thought about managed services, it was mainly you thought about the operations team, and somehow all the tools, the operations, were bolted onto this operations team just to make it somehow work. And our architecture is now different. The main part is the automation tool, the automation frame tool, frame set, the orchestration, the CenturyLink Cloud Application Manager, where customers can connect directly to via interfaces, via the ITSM tools. It's connected to their collaboration platforms. It has a standardized REST API. And even if customers don't want to use directly the Cloud Application Manager, it's okay. They just include one line of code, for example, into their Terraform templates, in their Chef cookbooks, or Ansible, or any other configuration management system, and workloads deployed via this way are automatically managed by CenturyLink. I think this is the main differentiator. And the result of this change in architecture is that you can use it pay as you use. It's all automated. You don't have to commit to any contract term for any workload. You switch it on if you need it, and if you don't need it anymore, you switch it off. Due to this automation, it's just a question of APIs. It's not limited anymore to the data center and the platforms located in the service provider's data center. You can use it as well for any cloud platform like AWS, Azure, or in the future as well for Google. And it's much more collaborative. As mentioned before, when the driver was mainly financially driven, the question was the enterprise handed over everything. Anything less wouldn't have made any financial sense. But now you can really select, for example, that you say, dev and test, that's not necessary to have it managed to pay for it. We just hand over the production systems to the service provider that he can take care of it, for example, 24/7. And as well, you get much more transparency. Before, the managed services were like a wrapper around the infrastructure. Now it's just the enterprise has a direct access. They can still use any console, any CLI, any API of a cloud provider, and still use the managed services of CenturyLink. And on the second part, they have as well the direct access to the CenturyLink automation infrastructure, and this way, for example, as well to the monitoring system. They see what our operations teams are seeing, and this makes things much easier if something happens.
Sure. So, to summarize that, I think when you bring all those things together, they are developments that were largely driven by what's working better for customers in a modern sort of cloud-enabled world, right? And I think a lot of companies that came out of that traditional managed services world still face some of the challenges of how they were doing business then, right? Whether that be the way they manage their sales engagements and the cost of sales, or the way they manage their contracting and really need to lock customers into long-term contracts and those kind of things. They really tried to fit that legacy model into the new cloud world, where I think CenturyLink's approach was very much looking at, okay, what are the great things about that cloud-enabled world? Things like flexibility, like scalability, like agility, and how can we take those things and allow customers to take all advantage of all of them and apply them to this managed services model and do it in a way that gives them flexibility and scalability, not just in how they deploy infrastructure resources, but also in how they access things like managed services, right? And I think you bring those two things together, right, into a platform where you can also start to leverage automation. You've got the transparency. You have the ability to collaborate with your service provider rather than just hand the keys over to them and have them run it for you. Then the transformation process of going from a traditional model where you're in your own data centers to the cloud, doesn't necessarily become as urgent as it might be, or it might have traditionally been. I think a lot of companies really feel pressure or a sense of urgency from leadership or from financial markets to say, oh, we're in the cloud, right? And that, that doesn't necessarily mean what those people think it means, right? In some cases, a cloud solution implies flexibility and scalability and agility that's not necessarily going to exist if you just take a legacy application and move it into the cloud world. You also need to go through a transformation process. And I think focusing your resources and your energy on that transformation is really what's differentiated the companies that have been able to excel in this world, versus the ones that are still sort of struggling with that transformation. And Akim, I know you've helped a number of companies on that front. Maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of what you see as the advantages of the CenturyLink model in the time that you've been working with the customers and supporting their efforts as a part of CenturyLink.
I think it's important there to come back to the one driver that was originally a motivation for enterprises to use managed services for IT. The driver, we don't want to do it. It's not strategic. And now it has become strategic. And hence the advantage is that we enable enterprises to keep this strategic asset IT. They are still flexible to define the architecture. They have the direct access. They have the direct access. They can use their own cloud accounts with the hyperscalers like AWS, Azure, or Google, and still use a managed service provider.
Maybe you could repeat just the last thing that you said.
They can keep the relationship with the hyperscaler. They can bring in their own cloud accounts from Azure, from AWS. They keep the relationship. So IT is still this strategic asset for them. And it gives them the flexibility to keep their own architecture and still use a managed service provider. And they can use this service provider consistently across all different platforms. It's the same features, the same tool, the same managed service architecture, and the same experience, how they see managed services. And this, in the end, gives them the possibility to have IT as something that drives their top-line growth, gives them new business opportunities. They can use all the things their developer use during the day. They can dive into new opportunities quickly, directly accessing the cloud infrastructure, and yet have the stability and reliability of a managed service.
Right. So, I think that's a great way to sort of wrap the whole thing up, right? Because if you think about what that cloud model has traditionally been, and over the course of the last few years, companies have, in many ways, sort of driven hard towards a particular platform in some cases. And so they've become dependent upon the tool set, the native tool set of an AWS or Azure, and they've kind of committed themselves to one. And now a lot of those companies are realizing that they, for whatever reason, want to have a multi-cloud solution. And so the flexibility that our approach provides of giving them standardization and taking their dependence on a single platform away is similar to what we might have been able to do when we're reducing someone's dependence on a legacy managed service provider, right? And so I think that when we think about things like what are the next steps, what do we want to leave you with? Most of the time when Akim and I get involved in customer conversations, they start with, what is the cloud adoption framework, right? And I'm sure many of you who've worked in the cloud world have heard that term before, but most of the cloud adoption frameworks from the cloud providers are specific to their platform. And so we would love to have a conversation with our customers about what does your cloud adoption framework look like in the context of a multi-cloud hybrid world where you can potentially take advantage of not only tools that can manage the stuff that's sitting in your legacy data center, that technology debt that's going to take a while to retire and evolve into the cloud, but also all of the workloads that you're putting on public cloud providers, even if you're using AWS and Azure and Google and maybe some of the other providers as well. So in parting, and as a thank you and a request for folks to follow up with us, we'd like to have that conversation with any of you, and we welcome the opportunity to talk to you, and then thank you for your time in listening to our webinar today. And Akeem, thanks a lot for your insights.
Welcome. Thank